My name is Lauren, and I never thought I would start a story with the image of a birthday cake sinking into the trash. Yet that's exactly how this began. Picture it a room filled with streamers, balloons, the sound of children laughing, the smell of vanilla frosting, and then the sharp crack of silence when my mother-in-law lifted the cake I had spent the night making and hurled it into the garbage. 1 second, we were halfway through singing happy birthday to my daughter Emily. The next, the centerpiece of her 7th birthday, the unicorn cake she had dreamed of for months, was lying face down among coffee grounds and leftover pasta. It was a moment that didn't just ruin a party. It split something open inside me. The frosting smeared against the trash bag wasn't just sugar and food dye. It was hours of work, years of patience, and every ounce of hope my daughter had for a magical day. My mother-in-law Ruth stood over the trash can like a judge passing a sentence, her voice calm, cold, deliberate. She doesn't deserve a celebration. The words cut like glass. Children froze mid-song, their hands still clapping in the air. Parents exchanged uneasy glances, and my husband Mark, gentle, brilliant, Mark just stood there paralyzed, his lips parting but no sound coming out. His silence felt heavier than Ruth's cruelty. Emily's eyes widened her little chest, rising and falling as though the air had suddenly turned too heavy to breathe. I wanted to scream. I wanted to lunge across the kitchen and snatch back the cake. But instead, I froze too. Because this wasn't the first time Ruth had crossed a line. It was just the most public, the most humiliating, the most unforgivable. And that is where my story begins. I'm Lauren, a 34-year-old teacher who thought I knew how to handle bullies until life handed me the one bully you're never prepared for, the grandmother of your child. This is the story of how a 7-year-old girl, my daughter, showed more courage than any adult in the room and taught me that truth has a way of breaking through silence, louder than any scream ever could. You might be wondering why a woman would destroy her own granddaughter's birthday cake in front of a house full of witnesses. That question hung in the air unanswered as crumbs slid down into the trash. And before I take you further, let me ask you this. Have you ever watched someone you love get hurt and realize that your silence made you part of the damage? That was me right then. This isn't just about a ruined cake. It's about years of control, whispered insults, and the slow erosion of joy. But it's also about what happens when a child decides she's had enough and pulls back the curtain for everyone to see. So stay with me. Because what Emily did next transformed humiliation into revelation. It turned a party gone wrong into the moment our family finally began to reclaim its freedom. And if you've ever had someone in your life who thought they had the right to define your worth, you'll want to hear how it all unfolded. I can still hear the echo of that sentence. She doesn't deserve a celebration, bouncing around the room as if the walls themselves had absorbed Ruth's cruelty. Nobody moved. The smell of extinguished birthday candles hung heavy in the air, mixing with the sting of embarrassment. My daughter's cake was gone, and so was the light in her eyes. What do you do when the person who is supposed to love your child unconditionally makes it their mission to crush her spirit? That was the question clawing at my chest as I looked at Emily's trembling hands. Her friends stood awkwardly by the table, unsure if they should comfort her or pretend nothing happened. The parents looked at me with sympathy, but also hesitation. No one wanted to be the first to speak against an elder in someone else's home. Mark remained frozen. His silence wasn't just frustrating, it was damning. It told me what I already knew, that his fear of confrontation outweighed his instinct to protect. I had spent years hoping he would find his voice, but at that moment I realized my daughter might not be able to wait for that day. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. You know how sometimes your mind splits in two. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw Ruth out right then and there. But the other part, the teacher in me, the mother who had coached kids through bullies and heartbreak, knew that the next move mattered. If I lost control, the story would become about me. But this wasn't my story anymore. It was Emily's. And in that pause, in that unbearable silence, my daughter wiped her eyes, squared her tiny shoulders, and whispered words I will never forget, Grandma. I made something for you, too. The room shifted. Parents leaned in. The kids stopped fidgeting. Even Ruth raised an eyebrow, suddenly curious. Emily walked toward her tablet on the counter, clutching it like it was a shield. My heart pounded. I had no idea what she meant. But before I tell you what happened when she pressed play, I need you to understand something important. This story, it's not just about family drama or a ruined party. It's about silence, about the cost of letting cruelty fester unchecked. It's about what happens when a child decides to hold up a mirror to an adult who should have known better. And it's about reclaiming power in the face of someone determined to take it from you. Now, I want to pause and ask you because your perspective matters here. Have you ever been in a room where someone said something so cruel, so cutting that you froze instead of speaking up? What did you do, or maybe what do you wish you had done? Drop your answer in the comments below, because sharing that moment could be the very thing that helps someone else find their voice today. And if you're still with me right now listening to this story, thank you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because Emily's response to her grandmother didn't just change the mood of that party. It changed the course of our family forever. When she turned on that screen, I had no idea that my 7-year-old had been quietly preparing for this confrontation for months. I didn't know she had been collecting evidence, piecing together something powerful enough to shatter Ruth's iron grip on our lives. The truth was about to come out not from me, not from Mark, but from the smallest voice in the room. And as you'll see, sometimes it's the smallest voice that tells the loudest truth. My name is Lauren, and if you're just joining me in this story, let me step back for a moment. I want you to understand who I am, not because this is about me, but because knowing the kind of life I led before that birthday makes what came next even clearer. I've always thought of myself as strong in quiet ways. I'm a teacher. I spend my days guiding classrooms full of kids through long division science projects and the kinds of playground conflicts that feel earth-shattering when you're 7. I'm trained to stay calm, to listen, to teach lessons not just from textbooks but from life itself. I thought I understood children better than most, but nothing could have prepared me for the courage my own daughter would show me that day. Mark, my husband of 9 years, is the sort of man people describe as gentle to a fault. He's a software developer, the kind of mind that can solve problems buried in hundreds of lines of code, but stumbles over words when it comes to defending himself or us. He's the man who apologizes when someone else bumps into him at the grocery store. I fell in love with that softness once, but the longer we were married, the more I realized that same softness had a shadow, a deep inability to confront the person who needed confrontation the most, his mother. And then there was Ruth. 62 years old, retired from banking, sharp as a whip, and twice as cutting. She was a woman who measured life by standards no one else could meet, and she believed it was her duty to remind us constantly of where we fell short. To her, I was never good enough for Mark. Teaching wasn't a real career. My cooking wasn't refined. My home was cluttered with sentimentality, and my daughter, to Ruth Emily, was the proof that imperfections ran in the bloodline. For years, I tried to meet her halfway. I tried polite smiles, careful conversations, and swallowing the sting of her barbed remarks for the sake of peace. But peace never came. Ruth wasn't interested in peace. She was interested in control. And here's the thing, you might think I'm exaggerating, that I'm painting her too harshly. But you have to picture at holidays where she criticized every dish I served, weekends where she dropped by just to point out dust on the shelves, phone calls where she asked Mark if he regretted settling for me. And through it all, Mark would sigh, rub his temples, and say the same thing: she means well. But meaning well and doing well are two very different things. And Ruth had been quietly eroding our family's foundation chip by chip for nearly a decade. Now, some of you listening might already feel the weight of recognition. Maybe you've had someone in your life who wears down your confidence piece by piece, all under the disguise of love or concern. If you have, then you know how exhausting it is. How you start doubting yourself, wondering if maybe they're right. That's where I was on the morning of Emily's birthday. I had convinced myself that maybe this time would be different. Maybe the handmade decorations, the careful planning, the love baked into every detail would soften Ruth's edges even just for one day. But standing in that kitchen watching my daughter's cake hit the bottom of the trash, I realized something important: Ruth would never change. And if she wouldn't, then something in us had to. That's when Emily, my little girl who still mispronounced spaghetti and insisted on naming her stuffed animals after Supreme Court justices, did the thing none of us adults could. She decided to take the story back into her own hands. And that right there was the turning point. Because from that moment forward, this wasn't about Ruth's cruelty anymore. It was about Emily's courage, and courage has a way of cutting through even the thickest silence. If I had to put Ruth into a single sentence, it would be this: she was a professional at finding joy and then dismantling it piece by piece. It wasn't always dramatic. In fact, her power lay in the small, relentless cuts, the kind that don't bleed right away, but leave you aching long after. From the very beginning, Ruth made it clear she didn't think I belonged. The first Christmas I spent with her, she looked me up and down and said, "Mark always dated women with ambition. Teaching is fine, I suppose, but hardly impressive." She said it in front of her book club friends like she was commenting on the weather. Mark squeezed my hand under the table, but said nothing. That was the pattern: her cutting remark, his silence, and me trying to swallow the humiliation. When Emily was born, Ruth treated motherhood like a competition. Every milestone became a measurement not of my daughter's growth, but of my inadequacy. Emily walked later than some babies, and Ruth clucked her tongue. In my day, we didn't coddle children. That's why they were stronger. When Emily scribbled on the wall with crayons, Ruth muttered, "Bad breeding always shows." Each comment was another stone laid on the weight pressing down on our home. She believed children should be seen, not heard, unless of course they were performing to her impossible standards. Straight A's, perfect posture, flawless manners. If Emily dared to be, well, a child laughing too loud, asking too many questions, delighting in silly games, Ruth would shut it down with a look or a phrase designed to sting. And Mark. He was caught in the middle, though caught is too generous a word. He let himself be tethered, torn between protecting us and pleasing her. He told me once she was like this with my dad, too. I learned early not to argue. I wanted to shout at him. That's exactly why you should argue now, but arguments never came, just excuses. So we endured it. Year after year, family gatherings where the air felt colder when she entered the room. Vacations where she criticized my packing skills. Phone calls where she recited Emily's supposed shortcomings like a tally sheet. And the worst part, she believed it was all for our own good. That she was shaping Emily into someone worthy. But here's the truth: I've learned control disguised as love is still control. And Ruth thrived on it. She wasn't content to comment from the sidelines. She had to be the director of our lives, holding the script and correcting every line we spoke. Looking back now, I see how much of my energy was spent trying to anticipate her reactions, trying to make things Ruth-proof. I folded fitted sheets the way she preferred. I served vegetables in exact portions she once lectured about. I made excuses for why Emily didn't want to speak to her on the phone. And still, it was never enough. What made it worse was the isolation. My family lived on the other side of the country. Holidays with them were rare visits, infrequent. Ruth filled the void with her constant presence, her constant judgment. I sometimes wondered if that was her plan all along, to wear me down until I either broke or surrendered completely. But here's the twist she never expected. What she underestimated wasn't me, it was Emily. Because even at 7, my daughter was watching. She was absorbing. And she was learning the lessons Ruth never intended to teach: that cruelty hides behind polite smiles, that silence can be complicity, and that sometimes the smallest person in the room sees the most. All those years Ruth spent trying to control us, she planted the seeds of her own undoing. And on Emily's birthday, in front of friends, parents, and witnesses, those seeds were about to bloom. Because when the cake hit the trash, Ruth thought she'd won. She thought she'd proven her power one more time. But what she didn't realize was that Emily had been preparing for months, quietly building something stronger than Ruth's grip, evidence, truth, and courage. And when Emily pressed play on that tablet, Ruth's reign began to crack. The morning of Emily's 7th birthday started so differently from how it ended. If you had walked into our house that day, you would have thought you were stepping into a scene from a picture book. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting golden shapes on the hardwood floor. Streamers and paper butterflies in every shade of purple and pink dangled from fishing line across the ceiling, fluttering each time the air conditioner kicked on. The smell of vanilla and strawberries, her favorite, floated in from the kitchen, where the cake I had finished at 2 in the morning waited like a treasure. Emily bounced into our bedroom at 6 a.m., already wearing the dress she had picked out weeks before, a deep violet cotton dress with tiny silver stars stitched along the hem. She clutched her tablet close to her chest, as if it were a diary full of secrets. "Mommy," she asked, her eyes wide with excitement, "do you think Grandma will like my surprise?" I remember the pause before I answered. I smoothed her hair back from her face and forced a smile. I'm sure she'll love whatever you made. The words tasted heavy because I knew Ruth's history. She hadn't loved anything we'd done in the 9 years since I became her daughter-in-law. But Emily didn't see that pause. She was too wrapped up in her excitement, her small shoulders practically quivering as she hugged that tablet tighter. For weeks, she'd been calling her project special homework. Every time I peeked into her room, she minimized the screen, flashing me a mischievous smile. I assumed it was a drawing, maybe a story. She had always been creative like that, scribbling tales about talking cats or astronauts who lived on Mars. Mark thought it was another game. Neither of us suspected she was preparing something far more significant. We spent 3 evenings together decorating the living room. Emily insisted on butterflies because, in her words, they start small but they grow wings. That's kind of like me, right? She didn't realize how right she was. I watched her tape each butterfly with meticulous care, her tongue poking out in concentration. At one point she whispered, "Maybe, if Grandma sees how beautiful they are, she'll understand why I love them." Even the cake was born from Emily's imagination. She handed me a crayon drawing of a unicorn with a rainbow mane, golden horn, and pink hooves and said, "This is what I want." We mixed the batter together, strawberry filling, and all her laughter ringing through the kitchen as she licked the spoon. "Remember when Grandma said unicorns are silly?" she asked quietly. "Maybe she'll change her mind." Hope. That's what Emily carried into that day, pure, unguarded hope. Hope that love could soften sharpness, that beauty could melt cruelty, that a handmade crown with glittery letters spelling "World's Best Grandma" could bridge the gap Ruth had carved for years. She decorated that crown herself, sitting cross-legged on the floor, sprinkling glitter like it was magic dust that might heal everything broken. And for a few hours that morning, I let myself believe it too. I let myself imagine Ruth walking in, seeing the butterflies, the cake, the handmade crown, and maybe, just maybe, smiling with real warmth. I imagined my daughter's face lighting up with pride as her grandmother finally saw her, not as a disappointment, but as a gift. But deep down I knew. The truth about people like Ruth is that no amount of glitter or sweetness can rewrite their story. They don't walk into rooms looking for joy. They walk in searching for flaws. And that's exactly what happened when she arrived at 2 o'clock, sharp purse clutched to her side, her eyes scanning the decorations like a health inspector ready to fail a restaurant. Yet before that storm broke, there was Emily, radiant, determined, full of hope. A little girl who believed love could be earned if she tried hard enough. She didn't know then that the most powerful thing she would give that day wasn't a crown or a decorated room. It was the truth she had quietly prepared in secret. And that truth would prove stronger than any cruelty Ruth could throw at her. The first sign that my hopes were misplaced came the moment Ruth stepped through the door. 2 o'clock sharp, just as she always arrived, never early, never late, like she was making a statement about control. She carried no gift, no balloon, not even a card. Just her oversized purse and that familiar look of disdain, the kind that could sour milk. Her eyes darted to the paper butterflies strung across the ceiling. Instead of wonder, she muttered, "All this for a 7-year-old children in my day were grateful for a simple dinner." Her words were sharp, but what made them cut deeper was that Emily heard them. My daughter's hands faltered as she adjusted the party favors, her shoulders slumping just slightly before she forced herself to keep going. The guests began to arrive, 3 of Emily's classmates and their parents, each carrying homemade gifts and treats. The room should have been filled with laughter, but Ruth stationed herself in a corner chair like a queen, holding court, issuing pronouncements whenever something displeased her. When Indigo showed Emily his new telescope app, Ruth declared children should be outside, not staring at screens. When Jasper laughed too loudly at his own joke, she shook her head. No discipline. When Waverly's mother reached for a cupcake, Ruth sniffed. Sugar is poison for developing minds. Each remark wasn't loud enough to stop the party, but it chipped away at the atmosphere. Parents exchanged uneasy glances. The children grew quieter as though afraid their joy might be labeled improper. And Emily, my bright, curious, silly Emily, straightened her back, adjusted her crown, and tried to hide the hurt pooling in her eyes. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Small comments each designed to remind us who held the power in the room. And Mark, as always, hovered at the edges, refilling cups, avoiding eye contact, whispering excuses. "She's just traditional," he murmured once, as if tradition excused cruelty. But here's what I want to ask you, listening to this right now. Have you ever been in a room where someone's words sucked the joy right out of the air, where you wanted to speak up but didn't and later replayed what you should have said? If you have, I want you to share it in the comments. Because those stories matter. They remind us that silence isn't harmless. It's fuel for people like Ruth. As I watched Emily place a glittery crown at Ruth's seat, a crown she had made herself, "World's Best Grandma" spelled out in shaky silver letters, I felt my heart split in two. On one side was pride at my daughter's kindness, her determination to keep believing in love. On the other was fury, knowing that Ruth would dismiss it with the same cold precision she applied to everything else. And I was right. Ruth didn't even touch the crown. She let it sit there like it was a prop in a play she refused to attend. But Emily didn't cry. She didn't even frown. She simply adjusted her friends' party hats, checked the butterfly decorations one more time, and carried on. She wasn't giving Ruth the satisfaction of ruining her day, not yet. The hour crawled forward, each game another opportunity for Ruth to sneer. Pin the horn on the unicorn, encouraging delusions. Face painting, teaching vanity. Musical chairs, promoting aggression. Every word landed like a stone on my chest. Yet Emily endured it all, her jaw set, her eyes determined. And though I didn't know it then, she wasn't just enduring, she was storing every moment away, adding fuel to the fire she was about to unleash. By the time I dimmed the lights and brought out the cake, the tension was a living thing in the room. The children gathered, the parents leaned in, and the candles glowed against Emily's hopeful face. But hope and cruelty were about to collide, and only one would survive. The moment of celebration, the one every child waits for, was supposed to be simple. Candles flickering, voices singing a wish, whispered before blowing out the flames. For Emily, it was supposed to be her proof that hope wasn't foolish, that maybe love could soften even the hardest heart. I carried the cake out slowly, the weight of 3 layers balanced carefully on the glass plate. The unicorn Emily had drawn weeks earlier had come to life in buttercream and fondant, golden horn, gleaming pink hooves tucked delicately beneath a rainbow mane. The children gasped in delight, the parents smiled warmly, and Emily's face glowed as she closed her eyes, ready to make her wish. That's when Ruth's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Stop this nonsense right now." The singing faltered mid-note. The room froze. Emily opened her eyes, startled, as Ruth pushed back her chair and stood. Her gaze swept the crowd before landing on my daughter, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This child got a C on her spelling test last week," she announced, her voice sharp and deliberate. "And you're rewarding her with this spectacle. This is exactly what's wrong with your generation. No consequences, no standards, just endless celebration of mediocrity." Gasps rippled through the room. Waverly's mother instinctively pulled her daughter closer. Indigo's dad frowned, his arms crossed tightly. Jasper, the class clown, suddenly looked solemn, his eyes darting between Emily and Ruth. Mark muttered weakly, "Mom, that's enough." But Ruth was already moving. With a determination that made my stomach drop, she marched toward me. Before I could react, her hands closed around the plate, the cake wobbling dangerously in her grip. "No," Emily cried, reaching out, but it was too late. Ruth carried the cake into the kitchen, her steps deliberate, as though she were performing a public service. She held it high over the trash can, her chin lifted, her voice firm. "She doesn't deserve a celebration." And then she let go. The sound was obscene, a wet thud, buttercream smashing against plastic strawberry filling, oozing out onto coffee grounds and orange peels. The unicorn's head rolled free, its golden horn glinting for a moment before it toppled into the mess. The smell of sugar and garbage mixed in the air, thick and nauseating. The silence afterward was louder than any scream. Biscuit, our golden retriever, whimpered in the corner, his ears pressed flat. Indigo's mom covered her mouth with both hands. Jasper stood perfectly still, for once speechless. And Emily, my little girl, stood staring at the trash can, her bottom lip trembling, her small fists clenched at her sides. I felt heat rise in my chest, every muscle in my body screaming to act. I wanted to grab Ruth by the shoulders, drag her out of my house, and scream until the whole neighborhood knew what she had done. My hands shook with the effort of holding back. Because in that instant, my maternal instinct wasn't just to protect Emily, it was to destroy the woman who had just crushed her spirit in front of everyone. But before I could move, before I could speak, I saw something change in Emily's face. The tears that had been pooling didn't fall. Instead, she drew in a breath, straightened her spine, and looked at her grandmother, not with fear, but with a strange, steady resolve. It wasn't the look of a child who had been beaten down. It was the look of someone who had decided right then that she would not let this moment define her. And as I stared at her stunned, I realized Ruth thought she had won. She thought she had proven her power once more. But in reality, she had just set the stage for her undoing. Because Emily wasn't about to cry, she was about to fight back. And she had a weapon none of us saw coming. Emily's lips trembled, her eyes glassy, and for a split second I thought she was going to break collapse into sobs the way any 7-year-old would after watching her dream cake tossed into garbage. I braced myself, already reaching out to scoop her into my arms. But then something extraordinary happened. She blinked once, twice, and the tears stopped. Her chin lifted just slightly, and a tiny, knowing smile crept across her face. Not a sad smile. Not the kind you force to hide pain. This was different. This was the kind of smile she wore when she'd solved a riddle before anyone else in class, or when she'd hidden a secret present under the tree and dared me to find it. "Grandma," she said, her voice steady, almost calm. "I made something special for you too. Do you want to see it?" The room shifted instantly. Parents who had been ready to gather their things paused. Children stopped fidgeting. Even Ruth froze her hand, still brushing crumbs from her skirt, like she had just completed some noble act. Her expression flickered just for a moment, from triumph to uncertainty. Mark looked at me, his eyes wide with confusion. I shrugged. I had no idea what Emily was talking about. Emily walked to the counter and picked up her tablet. She held it carefully, almost reverently, the way some people carry a family heirloom. She hugged it to her chest, then looked up at Ruth again. "It's for you, Grandma," she said, her voice sweet, but laced with something sharper beneath. "I've been working on it for a whole month." Ruth raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. A project, she asked, her tone suspicious. "Yes," Emily answered, already navigating the screen with the confidence of a child who knew exactly what she was about to unleash. "It's called The Important Women in My Life." The air in the room thickened. Parents exchanged glances. Even Biscuit patted out from his corner, sensing the tension. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest, torn between dread and curiosity. Here's the thing about children: adults often underestimate them. We assume they're too small, too fragile, too innocent to grasp the cruelty that surrounds them. But children see, they listen. And sometimes, when they've had enough, they act. I realized standing there in that crowded living room that my daughter had been acting all along. Quietly, patiently, she had been building her own defense. She wasn't going to scream or stomp her feet or collapse into tears. She was going to show us something undeniable, something even Ruth couldn't talk her way out of. And in that moment, as Emily set the tablet down and connected it to the TV, I felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost knocked me over. My daughter wasn't just surviving her grandmother's cruelty, she was about to expose it. Now I want to pause and tell you something important. This is the kind of turning point you don't forget. If you've ever had a moment where you decided enough is enough, where you stopped letting someone else's cruelty define you, I want you to share it. Because those stories matter. They remind us that even the smallest shift in courage can change everything. Emily straightened her crooked paper crown, took a deep breath, and pressed play. The TV flickered to life. Ruth leaned forward, expectant, still convinced she was about to be celebrated. But the truth was about to roll across that screen. And once it did, nothing in our family would ever be the same. Because in that room, in front of her friends, her classmates, and her grandmother Emily had decided to stop being the victim and start being the voice. The screen glowed to life with cheerful music, the kind you'd expect from a children's school project. Colorful letters danced across the television: "The Important Women in My Life" by Emily Hayes. Ruth's posture changed immediately. She leaned forward, smoothing her skirt, her lips curving into a smug smile. "Well," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "at least someone in this family recognizes the importance of honoring their elders." She was already basking in the attention, certain she was about to be painted as the heroine of Emily's story. But I caught something in my daughter's eyes as she stood tall in her crooked crown, tablet in hand. It was the same glint I had seen when she tricked Mark into losing at chess, the mischievous spark she got when she'd solved a puzzle before the rest of her class. My chest tightened. Whatever this was, Ruth wasn't prepared. The video began with Emily's recorded voice. "The most important woman in my life is my Grandma Ruth. She's taught me so many lessons. Let me show you what I've learned." Parents shifted uncomfortably, children leaned in, and Ruth actually lifted her chin as though she were about to be crowned queen. But then the first clip played. Grainy footage time-stamped from Thanksgiving 6 months earlier. The image wobbled, clearly filmed at tablet height, showing Ruth on the phone in our living room. Her voice rang out crisp and cruel. "That child is manipulative, just like her mother. She cries to get attention. Pathetic, really." The camera angle caught Emily in reflection, curled up on the couch, tears streaking her face, listening. The room went silent. Ruth's face drained of color. "How did you?" she started, but the video continued. Christmas morning. A FaceTime call. Ruth's voice echoing, Mark married beneath him. "Lauren can't cook, can't keep house, and she's raising a spoiled brat. I'm embarrassed to tell my friends about them." Gasps rippled through the room. One mother placed her hand over her child's ears. Mark staggered back like he'd been punched, his mouth opening, but no sound coming out. More clips rolled, each one sharper than the last. Ruth at Emily's school play. She has no talent, just like her mother, average at best. Ruth at her hairdresser. "That girl is chunky. She'll have weight problems just like Lauren's side." Ruth with her sister. "I'm documenting every mistake for future custody hearings. Mark deserves better." Every word was undeniable. Every clip, every timestamp, every sneer proof. Ruth clutched her purse straps, her knuckles white. "This is an invasion of privacy. You tricked me." But Emily's voiceover continued, calm and clear. "My grandma taught me that words can hurt worse than falling off my bike. She taught me that family isn't always kind. And she taught me that evidence is important when dealing with people who lie." The room wasn't just silent, it was heavy, thick with truth. Parents who moments ago were polite guests now looked at Ruth with barely concealed disgust. The children, even at their age, seemed to understand something important had shifted. And Ruth. She was no longer in control. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked small. Now, before I tell you the worst clip, the one that shattered the last of her facade, I want you to stay with me. Because if you think what you've heard so far is brutal, you need to know the real bombshell was still coming. And trust me, you won't want to miss how Emily turned her grandmother's own words into the sharpest weapon of all. So if you're still listening, make sure you hit subscribe right now, because the truth that came next changed everything. Emily took a step back from the television, her tiny hand slipping into mine. She squeezed 3 times our secret code for "I love you." I squeezed back tears in my eyes because I understood this wasn't just a project. This was her way of standing up, her way of saying, "We don't have to be silent anymore." And the next clip, that was the one that broke Ruth completely. The screen froze for a second, then shifted into the final clip. The timestamp read just 3 weeks ago. It was recorded in Ruth's own living room, angled from the corner of Emily's tablet propped discreetly on a shelf. Ruth's voice slithered across the speakers, low and venomous. "I'll make sure that girl never inherits a cent. If Mark doesn't come to his senses, I'll call child services. I'll tell them Lauren is unstable, unfit. I'll bury her in paperwork until she drowns. No court will side with her if I have anything to say about it." The room erupted. A mother gasped audibly. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." My knees nearly buckled, but Mark caught my arm, his face pale as stone. He wasn't just shocked, he was devastated. This wasn't his mother being cruel in passing. This was calculated, strategic. She had been plotting to destroy me, to rip Emily away, and she had spoken it aloud without realizing a little girl was recording. Emily's voiceover returned steady and heartbreaking. "But the most important thing Grandma taught me is that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who hurt you the most. And that's why I want to remember these lessons, so I don't become like her." Silence fell like a heavy curtain. No one moved. The music ended, the screen went black, and yet the weight of those words lingered in every corner of the room. Ruth shot up from her chair, her face blotchy with rage. "This is manipulation. You people don't understand." She twisted my words. But Mark cut her off, his voice trembling but firm. "No, Mom. That's your voice. Your words. Your cruelty. And you said them in our home in front of our daughter. You can't spin your way out of this." For the first time, Ruth looked around and saw no allies. Parents she once courted with charm now glared at her. Some shook their heads in disgust. Even the children stared wide-eyed, processing the betrayal. Ruth reached for her purse, her movements jerky, desperate. "I don't have to sit here and be ambushed." she snapped, her voice cracking under the weight of her own exposure. But Emily, still wearing her paper crown, stepped forward. Her voice was soft, but it carried more power than any adult in that room. Grandma, you always said I was weak. But I'm not. I'm stronger because I know who I don't want to be. That line cut sharper than any evidence, sharper than any video. Ruth faltered, her lips opening and closing like she was searching for the perfect defense, but none came. She clutched her bag and stormed out, the slam of the front door echoing like a final verdict. The silence afterward was surreal. Biscuit barked once, a sharp sound that broke the tension, and then people began to murmur, to shift uncomfortably. One mother hugged Emily, whispering, "You're so brave." Another father muttered, "She deserved every second of that." But me, I just held my daughter. My hands trembled as I kissed the top of her head, overwhelmed with pride and grief all at once. I wanted to shield her from ever having to know this kind of darkness. But I also realized something: she wasn't just surviving it, she was teaching all of us what resilience looked like. Now I need to pause here. If you've ever faced someone who tried to control your story, who tried to weaponize lies against you, I want you to comment below, tell your story, because when we share, we take back power. That night, as the guests slowly left, murmuring their disbelief, one truth lingered in my chest. Ruth wasn't coming back from this. She had revealed herself too completely. And Emily. She had taken control in a way none of us saw coming. But what I didn't realize then was that the fallout, the ripple effects of that night were only just beginning. And some of them would change our lives in ways we never expected. When the last guest filed out and the door clicked shut, the house felt like a different place altogether. The colorful balloons from Emily's project still bobbed against the ceiling, but the air was heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I sat on the couch, Emily curled into my lap, her crown crumpled but still clinging to her head. Mark lingered by the window, staring into the night like he was trying to find answers in the darkness. No one spoke for a long time. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was thick with the weight of what had just happened. Finally, Mark turned to me, his face pale but resolute. "I can't believe my own mother planned to destroy you, to take Emily." His voice cracked on our daughter's name, and I felt his pain as if it were my own. I squeezed Emily closer. "We have the truth now. That's what matters." But the truth had consequences, and I knew they were coming. The very next morning, my phone buzzed relentlessly. Parents from the project group texted me one after another. Some messages were short: "We're proud of Emily." Others were longer, filled with apologies for ever doubting us and gratitude that we had let them witness what real courage looked like. One mother even asked if Emily would come speak to her daughter about standing up to bullies. The support was overwhelming, but there was also fear. Word had spread beyond our neighborhood. Someone had uploaded a clip of the project presentation, edited, but still damning. Within hours, it was circulating online. By noon, the video had hundreds of comments. Strangers weighed in, condemning Ruth's words, praising Emily's bravery. Some called it the ultimate generational clapback. Mark's phone buzzed too, but his messages were different. His sister, who hadn't spoken to us in months, texted him angrily. "How could you let your wife and daughter humiliate Mom like that? You're ungrateful." Other relatives chimed in, trying to paint Ruth as the victim. But for once, Mark didn't waver. He typed back a single line: "She humiliated herself." For me, the fallout came in quieter ways. At the grocery store, an older neighbor avoided eye contact, her face tight. At the same time, a young cashier leaned close and whispered, "That was brave. Don't let anyone tell you different." The divide was clear. Some people were horrified, some were inspired. But the biggest change was inside our own home. That night, Mark sat beside Emily at the kitchen table. She was coloring absent-mindedly, the paper crown now taped back together. He placed his hand over hers. "Emily, I'm sorry," he said softly. "I should have protected you from her words, from all of it." Emily looked up, her eyes wide and honest. "It's okay, Daddy. You taught me how to play chess. You said the queen is the most powerful piece, but only if she knows when to move. That's what I did. I moved." Tears stung Mark's eyes. He pulled her into his arms, and I watched something shift in him. He wasn't just a son anymore, chained by guilt and loyalty. He was a father first, finally seeing where his true allegiance lay. Still, I couldn't ignore the ache in my chest. Ruth might have stormed out, but she wasn't the kind of woman to disappear quietly. She had power, money, and influence, and she had already threatened to use them against me. The evidence was out there now, but so was the risk. Before bed, I stood at the window, the streetlight casting long shadows across our lawn. I whispered to myself, half a vow, half a prayer, we survived tonight. But the war isn't over. And in that moment, I realized something else. Stories like ours don't just end when the door slams shut. They echo, they ripple. And I want to know, have you ever felt those ripples in your own family? Share it with me below. Because your story might be the one that helps someone else survive their storm. As I crawled into bed beside Mark, I felt his hand find mine. We were united now in a way we hadn't been before. Ruth had tried to fracture us, but instead she had forged us stronger. What none of us knew, though, was that Ruth wasn't finished. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. And the next move she made would test everything we thought we'd secured. 3 days passed, 3 long, uneasy days, where silence felt like the eye of a storm. Ruth hadn't called, she hadn't shown up, she hadn't even texted Mark. That should have been a relief, but in my gut, I knew it wasn't over. Ruth wasn't the kind of person to lick her wounds in private. She was a strategist, and strategists only went quiet when they were planning their next move. The confirmation came on a Thursday afternoon. A thick, cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail, stamped with the name of a prestigious law firm downtown. I froze as I slid it open, the paper trembling in my hands. Inside was a formal notice. Ruth was petitioning the court for grandparent visitation rights, citing concerns for Emily's emotional well-being in a hostile environment. I felt the blood drain from my face. Emily wandered into the kitchen just then, holding Biscuit under one arm. "Mom, what's wrong?" she asked innocently. I shoved the letter into a drawer before she could see it. Mark arrived home an hour later, and when I showed him the notice, his jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. "She's not just coming after you now," he muttered. "She's coming after all of us." That night, after Emily went to bed, we sat together in the dim glow of the living room lamp. "She'll spin this," I said bitterly. "She'll play the victim. She'll tell the court she was set up at the project, that we humiliated her unfairly. She'll say you're blinded by me." Mark shook his head. "Not this time. Not after what we saw on that video. I won't let her twist it again." His voice was firm, but I could hear the tremor underneath. Because the truth was, Ruth still had resources we didn't. Connections, money, a reputation in town that until recently had seemed untouchable. The following days were a whirlwind. Parents from Emily's class reached out offering to testify about what they'd witnessed during the project night. One mother even said she'd saved a copy of the clip before it was taken down online. Support was rallying behind us, but so were whispers from Ruth's allies. At the hardware store, a man I barely knew leaned over and sneered, "You're tearing a family apart." For what attention? At church, I caught fragments of murmurs. They embarrassed her publicly. No wonder she's fighting back. The divide was widening, just as Ruth wanted. She thrived in shadows, in manipulation, in sowing doubt. And yet, even in the middle of that chaos, Emily surprised me. One evening, she was sprawled on the carpet with biscuit coloring in one of her notebooks. She looked up and said matter-of-factly, "Grandma's like the villain in the chess stories Daddy tells. She thinks she's winning, but she doesn't see she's already trapped." I smiled weakly. "And who's the one trapping her?" Emily's eyes sparkled. "We are, because we're telling the truth." Her words sank deep into me. They reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten, that sometimes holding on to truth is the only strategy you need. But before I could savor that flicker of hope, the phone rang. It was a local reporter, her tone clipped and professional. "We're doing a piece on family disputes and the role of grandparents. Mrs. Collins has agreed to an interview tomorrow. Would you like to comment?" I nearly dropped the phone. Ruth wasn't hiding anymore. She was stepping into the spotlight, ready to twist the narrative for everyone to see. And in that moment, I understood this wasn't just a legal fight. It was a war for the story itself, who got to define what happened, who got to decide what Emily's childhood would mean. Now pause with me for a second. What would you do if someone with power and influence tried to rewrite your life to make you the villain of your own story? Would you fight? Would you stay silent? Tell me in the comments, because your answers might help someone else who's facing the same battle. That night, as I lay awake listening to the quiet hum of the house, I made myself a promise. Ruth wanted a stage fine. We would give her one. but this time she wouldn't control the script. Little did I know the court hearing would reveal far more than anyone expected. Secrets that even Mark didn't see coming. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and old paper, a strange mix of dignity and dread. I sat beside Mark at the long oak bench, clutching Emily's small hand as if it were my lifeline. Ruth sat across the aisle, flanked by her high-priced attorneys. She wore a pale blue suit, pearls gleaming against her throat, and an expression so serene you'd think she was the victim here. When the judge entered, the room hushed. Papers shuffled, pens clicked. My pulse drummed in my ears. Ruth's lawyer was the first to rise. He spoke smoothly, spinning a tale of a grandmother cruelly maligned, humiliated by a manipulative daughter-in-law who poisoned her son and granddaughter against her. Mrs. Collins, he said gravely, only wishes for a relationship with her granddaughter, to protect her, to love her. I felt my stomach twist. Love? That was the word she dared to use. Then it was our turn. Our lawyer played the video. The courtroom filled with Ruth's own voice, sharp and cutting, as she declared that Emily didn't belong, that I wasn't real family. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some people shook their heads, others looked at Ruth with open disgust. Her mask cracked. For the first time, I saw her eyes flash with something close to fear, but she wasn't finished. She leaned forward suddenly and demanded to speak. Against our lawyer's objection, the judge allowed her. She stood hands clasped like a martyr and delivered a speech dripping with practiced sorrow. I was provoked. I was baited. A child's project turned into a public trial against me. Surely you can understand how words spoken in pain shouldn't define me. She dabbed at imaginary tears. I only wanted to be there for my granddaughter. But this woman she pointed at me twists everything I do. She's tearing this family apart. For a moment her performance worked. The room softened. Even the judge leaned back thoughtfully. And then Emily stood up. She wasn't supposed to. She wasn't called as a witness. But she slipped her hand out of mine and walked toward the center of the courtroom crown of braids, bouncing with each determined step. Judge, her voice piped up clear and trembling but strong. "Can I say something?" The judge raised his brows. "Go ahead, young lady." Emily swallowed, then lifted a notebook from under her arm. It was the same one she'd been coloring in at home. She flipped to a page covered in careful handwriting. "This is what Grandma said to me when no one else was around. She told me Mommy was a stranger, that Daddy would leave us one day, and that she'd take me to live with her instead. She said family means blood, not love. But that's not true. Family is who shows up." You could hear a pin drop. Ruth's face went pale. Emily held up another page, a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures, me, Mark, and herself holding hands under a house with a bright yellow sun. "This is my family," she said simply. Something broke open in that room. A murmur rose, not of doubt, but of quiet awe. Even the judge's stern face softened as he leaned forward. "Thank you, Emily," he said gently. Our lawyer didn't need to say more. Emily had spoken the truth in a way no adult ever could. The ruling didn't come that day, but I could feel the tide shifting. Ruth gathered her papers with shaking hands, her composure gone. For once, her carefully built fortress of control had cracks too wide to ignore. And yet, as she passed by us on her way out, she leaned down just enough to whisper in my ear, "This isn't over." Her words chilled me, but something inside me had changed. I wasn't afraid anymore. Emily had stood her ground. Mark had finally chosen his side. And I realized we weren't just surviving Ruth's attacks. We were building something she could never touch, a family defined by choice, loyalty, and love. But I'll tell you this, when someone like Ruth promises it isn't over, you'd better believe she means it. And what she tried next was beyond anything I could have imagined. Have you ever faced someone who tried to rewrite your truth with lies? Drop your story in the comments, because when we share these battles, we remind each other we're not fighting alone. The courthouse battle should have been the end. We walked out that day believing Ruth had lost her grip, that Emily's brave words had cracked her armor wide open. But Ruth was not the kind of woman to retreat quietly. She didn't believe in losing, only in biding her time. A week later, the phone rang late in the evening. It was my sister Jenna, her voice tight with urgency. "You need to sit down," she said. I don't know how to tell you this, but Ruth went on television tonight. My stomach dropped. I switched on the news. There she was, Ruth Collins, framed by soft lighting, her expression crafted into grandmotherly heartbreak. All I've ever wanted, she told the anchor, was to love my granddaughter. But my son's wife, she's shut me out. She's poisoned Emily against me. Imagine being a grandmother and told you don't belong, that your blood doesn't matter. She sniffled dramatically. I was humiliated in that courtroom. All I ask is for the right to love my own flesh and blood. The anchor nodded sympathetically. Comments began flooding the broadcast's social feed. Some people defended us, but many more were swayed by Ruth's tears. How could they keep a grandmother from her granddaughter? That woman sounds bitter. Poor Ruth. Mark slammed the remote onto the coffee table. She's rewriting everything again, he growled. She's making herself the martyr. But it got worse. The following day, a manila envelope appeared in our mailbox. Inside were photocopies of old financial records, Mark's college tuition, hospital bills from his childhood. Every page bore Ruth's name as the payer. Scrawled in red pen across the top was one sentence: "Don't forget who made you who you are." Mark's face went ashen. "She's digging through my past," he whispered. "She's weaponizing it." It was a low blow, and it worked. For nights, Mark grew quieter, shadows under his eyes deepening. Ruth had struck his deepest guilt, that no matter how twisted she'd become, she had once provided for him. She wanted him chained to her, bound by debts that couldn't be repaid. One evening I found him staring at an old photo album, Ruth's handwriting curling across the margins. Emily crept beside him and slipped her hand into his. "Daddy," she said softly, "you don't owe her forever. You owe us now." Those words snapped something in him. Mark closed the album and whispered, "She can't own me anymore." Still, Ruth wasn't finished. A few days later, our lawyer called. She's filed an emergency petition. She claims Emily is in emotional distress under your care. She's submitted statements from neighbors saying you isolate the child, deny her family contact. I felt my chest seize. Lies, brazen, calculated lies. And yet they were on official record now. At the emergency hearing, Ruth strode in with her lawyers, armed with signatures and sworn statements. But here's the twist she didn't anticipate. One of her own witnesses recanted on the stand. A neighbor, Mr. Callahan, a gruff widower, admitted Ruth had pressured him. "She came to my porch," he said, voice gravelly. "Told me if I didn't sign I'd regret it. Said she'd ruin me at the club. I signed 'cause I was scared. But it wasn't true. That little girl over there." He nodded toward Emily. "She's got more love in her home than I've seen in 50 years. The courtroom buzzed. Ruth's face turned the color of chalk. It was the moment we realized Ruth's empire of control was finally collapsing, not because of lawyers, not because of money, but because people were no longer willing to protect her lies. And yet, as we left the courthouse, Mark turned to me and said quietly, "This isn't her last move. She has one more card to play. And when she does, it won't just target us, it'll target everything we've built." He was right. What came next would test us in ways we never imagined. But before I tell you that, pause for a moment. What would you do if someone kept dragging your family's name through the mud on TV and court in your own neighborhood? Would you fight louder, or would you try to disappear? Let me know in the comments, because stories like yours might help someone else survive their storm. I thought we'd seen the worst of Ruth. The courtroom battles, the media smear campaign, the neighbors whispering behind our backs, each of those moments nearly broke us. But Mark was right, Ruth had saved her final strike for last. And when it came, it was designed to destroy us completely. It started with a knock at the door, one gray morning. A social worker stood on our porch, flanked by 2 officers. Emily clung to my side, trembling. The worker explained that an anonymous report had been filed, claims of neglect, emotional abuse, unsafe living conditions. I didn't need to ask who filed it. Only Ruth would weaponize the system this way. They inspected our home. They checked the pantry. Emily's room even lifted the bathroom rug as if they'd find monsters hiding underneath. Emily sat on her bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit, answering questions no child should have to. "Does mommy ever hurt you? Does daddy yell all the time? Do you feel unsafe here?" When they left, they promised to follow up. I collapsed against the wall, shaking with rage. Ruth had taken it too far. She wasn't just trying to reclaim power anymore. She was trying to brand us as unfit parents, to rip Emily out of the only home she knew. That night, Mark made a decision. "We can't just defend ourselves anymore," he said, voice low but resolute. "We have to go on the offense. We need to show the truth, not just to a judge, not just to our neighbors, but to the whole world." So we did. With our lawyer's guidance, we compiled everything: the recordings, the court transcripts, Ruth's threats scribbled across old bills, the testimony of neighbors she'd pressured. We even included Emily's own words, her drawing, her notebook entries, her voice. And then we gave it to a journalist who had been following the case quietly for months. The article exploded. Headline after headline called it out for what it was: powerful grandmother's campaign of control, the family who fought back when blood isn't thicker than truth. For the first time, Ruth's carefully constructed image shattered under the weight of facts she couldn't rewrite. The public that once pitied her now saw her for what she was: a manipulator who had tried to weaponize love, law, and loyalty. The follow-up visit from the social worker was very different. She smiled gently at Emily, told us our home was warm and safe, and closed the file with a reassuring nod. Ruth's final attack had backfired. But the real victory came not in headlines or courtrooms. It came one quiet evening when Emily crawled onto my lap, pressed her cheek against my chest, and whispered, "We're safe now, right?" Yes, I told her, we're safe, and we're together. Ruth faded from our lives after that. Maybe she finally realized she couldn't win, or maybe the glare of exposure forced her into retreat. Either way, her shadow no longer hung over us. In the end, we learned something Ruth never could: that family is not about debt or blood or control. It's about showing up, choosing each other again and again, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. And if you're listening right now, maybe you faced someone like Ruth, someone who thought they could dictate your life, rewrite your story, steal your peace. Hear me when I say this: they don't get to define you. You do. If this story struck a chord with you, don't just move on. Stick with us. Hit subscribe, explore the other stories we share, and carry these lessons with you, because somewhere out there, someone else needs to hear that they're not alone. When the storm finally passed, what remained was silence. Not the heavy, suffocating kind Ruth used to impose, but a soft quiet, like the hush after a thunderstorm when the air feels cleansed. I remember one evening, weeks after everything ended. The three of us, Mark, Emily, and I, sat on the back porch, watching fireflies blink against the dusk. Emily leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "It feels like the world is ours again." And she was right. Without Ruth's shadow looming over us, even the ordinary became extraordinary. Breakfast pancakes tasted sweeter, laughter carried farther, sleep came easier. It would be easy to tell you we forgot Ruth completely, that we erased her from our memories. But that wouldn't be true. The scars she left on Mark, on me, on Emily are real. Yet those scars no longer ache. They remind us of how far we've come, of the strength we didn't know we had until we were forced to find it. Every now and then, Emily asks if she'll ever see her grandmother again. I tell her the truth, maybe, maybe not. But what matters isn't whether Ruth is in her life. It's that Emily knows she gets to choose who belongs in her story. That's the freedom Ruth never understood. As for me, I've learned this family isn't about obligation or blood or fear. It's about presence. About showing up, protecting, and loving without strings attached. So if you take one thing from our story, let it be this: no matter who tries to rewrite your life, you hold the pen. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is write a different ending.